Story 1. If your IT professional isn't swamped with work, they're actually excelling at their job, not failing. There's no need to consider letting them go. I recall a friend of mine who stood up for me in a similar situation many years ago. Back in the day, I was the sole IT expert at a relatively small company. Then one day during a meeting, someone caught me sneaking in a game of Quake 3 and questioned, "What on earth are we paying him for?" Thankfully, my friend intervened asking, "Is your email working? Can you access the internet? Are all of our servers running smoothly?" That's exactly what we pay him for. I once quit a job because they accused me of slacking off after I had poured in up to 80-hour work weeks for a whole year and finally got everything under control. Once things were stable, I naturally had less to do. Here's a fundamental point every employer should realize. You're compensating someone to achieve results, not just to perform tasks. While certain tasks might be a part of that process, if they're unnecessary to achieve the goal, there's no sense in doing them. Forcing an efficient, skilled employee to stay busy with superfluous tasks is an affront to their abilities. Think of your IT professional as akin to a security guard. You want them to have those moments of boredom. Story 2. An elevator will smoothly rise to the top of the hoist rather than abruptly descending to the floor in most severe mishaps, thanks to the counterweights. So you might be wondering, did they just make this up in movies and TV? Well, if the cable breaks, you'll descend, and that's the typical catastrophic failure you see in movies because it's more thrilling. Typically, lifts or elevators are equipped with 4, 8, 12, 16, or more cables. They can't all break at once. They can be cut or something can damage them, but each cable should individually support the lift's weight. There are typically between 4 and 16, or more in some very tall express elevators like those in the US skyscrapers, per lift car. Moreover, many lifts in tall buildings have brakes designed to gently slow the lift by gripping onto something, essentially metal parts grabbing metal parts. In smaller buildings, they aren't used because they take time to kick in. They're not instant. They initiate instantly, but it takes time to slow the lift down. It's like stopping a car at 20 miles an hour. You don't stop immediately. You continue for a few meters. If the building is only 20 or 30 meters high, it's not worth it. But I've never heard of any major accidents or injuries from a 25-meter lift unexpectedly descending with people inside. Or even a 600-meter lift for that matter. I guess if a meteor were to strike the lift shaft like an Armageddon or something, sure, that could make the lift fall. But that's the least of the problems. They'd be done from the shockwave before the car hits the bottom. Or if a colossal 4-mile-high tsunami is approaching, admittedly, yes, it might disrupt the electronics, magnets, and everything else, and the lift might pause for a moment. But I mean, microseconds later, the entire building is swept away, and everyone's gone from the concrete and pressure, so in reality, the emergency brakes won't be of much help. I've never come across that before. That would make for quite a hectic overtime report. Or to be a bit more straightforward, regarding that specific horrible attack that happened in history, I'm pretty sure some lift or elevator cables were cut. I'd bet my money that the people in those cars, when the planes hit, were still suspended in the shaft until the buildings came down. To the best of my knowledge, there are no reports from responders suggesting that elevator shafts at ground level contain cars filled with corpses. So there you have it, a real-life disaster movie. Even a plane crashing into a building, cutting all the cables, causing an explosion, and shutting down the shafts won't make them fall. I read a study that concluded that out of all the methods of moving people, from high-speed trains and airplanes to walking and escalators, elevators are in fact the safest mode of transportation, no matter how you look at it. That's a crazy fact, bro, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm still haunted by those elevator accident scenes from horror movies. Story 3. Implementing a corporate policy that mandates users to change their passwords every 90 days doesn't necessarily enhance your system's security. In reality, it often leads to decreased security. The same can be said for most password complexity requirements, so when you enforce a 12-plus character password that can't be easily found in a dictionary, your users tend to jot it down on a sticky note. I've been attempting to raise this concern within my current workplace, but they are unwavering in their stance because it's what corporate demands. While I don't want to hear complaints when someone discovers sticky notes around the office or shop with people's usernames and passwords scribbled on them, wreaking havoc, then there are those requirements that prevent you from using anything related to your previous passwords. I really can't stand it. At my previous job, passwords can even have characters repeating twice or more consecutively. For example, if I tried to set hello and then some random numbers, it wouldn't allow it because of the double L's in hello. Utterly nonsensical. Rules like that actually facilitate brute force in passwords because they eliminate so many possibilities. Attackers can skip any combination with the same letter repeated twice or more. Furthermore, these restrictions not only limit the characters set for those but also increase the likelihood that users will adopt a predictable password scheme and change it every 90 days. So if their initial password was SunnyD4YS1, they might switch to SunnyD4YS2 after 90 days, then SunnyD4YS3 after 180 days, and so on. If I had already cracked a previous password and got locked out due to the change, all I have to do is check if they've reiterated in the previous one, and I'm back in. And I also know I'm in for the next 90 days. Story 4. The most effective approach to help a child dealing with anxiety is addressing their parents' anxiety. For those who may be wondering, I'm a licensed mental health professional with a specialization in working with children. I appreciate the recognition that anxiety is a normal, healthy response that everyone experiences. That's absolutely true. Worries serve as our internal alarm system, helping to keep us safe by alerting us to potential dangers. It's when these worries start interfering with daily life that they become a concern. They often view anxiety issues on a spectrum, with a healthy level at one end and diagnosable anxiety disorders at the other. People fall all along the spectrum and can benefit from therapy or learning adaptive strategies. As some have rightly pointed out, a child's anxiety isn't solely a result of their parents' anxiety. There are, of course, situations where a child's anxiety stems from other circumstances. However, in the majority of cases of childhood anxiety, treating the parent can significantly help. Children look to their parents for cues on what's safe or not. They absorb information like sponges, constantly learning how to react to various situations. A straightforward example of this is when a child experiences a minor injury or scare. They instinctively turn to a trusted adult to gauge their reaction. If the adult gasps, rushes over with open arms, and looks concerned, the child learns that the situation was bad and they should be upset or scared. On the other hand, if the parent simply smiles, shrugs, and says, "Oh well," the child is likely to brush it off and move on, unless, of course, there's a genuine injury. Now think about this on a larger scale. If a child consistently learns that the world is a scary and dangerous place, filled with threats, they're being primed for anxiety issues. The same principles applies to specific phobias, which can often be directly taught to children when they witness their parents' fear. There's nothing more convincing than the person you depend on for your well-being displaying genuine fear. Just having conversations with children about a scary or uncomfortable experience can make a significant difference. If you can explain what made a particular experience dangerous or frightening, it helps teach them what to watch out for instead of generalizing their fear to any similar situation. A common example is children's fear of bugs. These children have never had a negative experience with insects, but the fact that their parents run away in terror every time they encounter one sends a clear message that bugs aren't safe to be around. Nothing reinforces fear more effectively than the person you trust the most in the world panicking in their presence. This can be especially true when they try to comfort you after your near escape from a menacing caterpillar. Story 5. Beneath your feet lies an astonishing web of infrastructure. It's truly surprising how much public utility is hidden beneath private property. Always remember to make a call before you start digging. Growing up, we had a garden in our backyard. I used to dig in the areas where my mom hadn't planted anything. One morning, I decided I was going to dig my way to China. I was young, after all, and kept digging until I struck a thick black cord. I prodded at it with a shovel and saw a multitude of colors inside. I thought I'd unearthed some hidden treasure. But in reality, what I was looking at was a bundle of individual wires inside that cord. Unfortunately, what I had actually done was disrupt the cable TV for the entire street. It must have been both telephone and TV, as I distinctly recall my mom sitting in front of a TV screen filled with static when I returned indoors after my excavation. This little adventure occurred back in 1985. That's why there was static on the TV and there were no high-speed fiber connections involved. Story 6. Detecting lies is a challenge for most people, and when tested, they typically perform no better than random guessing, 50-50. The success rate does slightly improve when they're dealing with someone they know, but the difference isn't significant. Ironically, many individuals tend to overestimate their ability to spot lies, but their self-assessments are often off the mark. Adding to this, experienced detectives don't have a slightly better track record in distinguishing truth from deception compared to rookie police officers. The primary distinction lies in their self-belief that they excel in this skill. I also recall reading that among law enforcement professionals, the only group that consistently performed better than chance were Secret Service officers, thanks to some specialized training in interpreting nonverbal cues from strangers. Even so, their accuracy hovers at around 70%. There's an intriguing interview technique where the interviewer asks the interviewee to recount their version of an event multiple times, focusing on one specific sense during each retelling. They describe what they saw, then what they heard, followed by what they smelled and what they felt. Subsequently, this transcript is fed into a computer which calculates the word count and unique words used and creates a ratio that can determine whether the person might be lying. It's believed to be accurate more than 80% of the time. The theory behind it is that it's challenging to maintain multiple false narratives simultaneously. So liars tend to keep their stories concise and less elaborate. People are so bad at spotting lies they'll even lie to themselves and believe it. Like when I told myself I was going to the homecoming party, even though I knew I wasn't. But you know what's not a lie? It's that you'll enjoy the rest of my videos. Give this one a like and subscribe to my channel for more. Story 7. There is no such thing as a flawless aircraft. Every plane you step onto has a variety of maintenance issues, but they aren't critical enough to compromise safety during the flight. My apologies to everyone taking a flight today. Please rest assured there's no need to fret. Planes remain the safest mode of travel. Don't let this information scare you. These issues are well taken care of. Of course, too many problems can be problematic and cause issues, but any complex machine, particularly when humanity's safety is at stake, is equipped with backup systems. And it could be worse. If I recall correctly, the Saturn V had an astonishing component failure tolerance, something like 10%. Imagine sitting atop over 7.5 million pounds of thrust and contemplating, maybe 10% of this might not be working correctly. So there's no need to worry about planes. As it turns out, my memory was incorrect. Someone clarified that NASA had the 3 nines policy for the space program, aiming for 99.9% reliability. This implies that out of the 6 million components in a Saturn V, up to 6,000 could still fail in a successful launch. But even with these facts, there's no need to sweat the planes. Sure, let's use these imperfect machines to get to the future. I'm sure they won't crash and burn, unlike your last relationship. Story 8. An electrical engineer is not the same as an electrician. I make a living repairing large format printers. These machines are designed by electrical engineers who earn a pretty penny for their work. I can easily diagnose a faulty fuse in a printed circuit board and replace it. However, if the customer encounters a CPU error or a deeper issue, I usually recommend replacing the entire board. Every so often, I encounter a customer who questions, "You're a certified tech, so why can't you repair the board? Are you just trying to persuade me to buy a new one?" In these cases, I have to clarify that electrical engineers spend many years in school learning to design these intricate boards and earn a substantial income doing so. If I had the expertise to design them, I wouldn't be fixing printers. Most people understand this, but there are a few who remain skeptical. Here's a fun anecdote. My brother was installing a new kitchen sink and realized that the sink he had chosen was far too heavy for the existing counterstructure. His solution was to turn to me and say, "You're an engineer. Can you design something?" I thought, sure, why not? So I cobbled together some boards in a way that seemed like it might support the weight. I installed this makeshift solution under his new sink. Surprisingly, a couple of years later, it still seems to be holding up. Engineering for the win, I guess. Story 9. The maximum space between spindles and a railing is 4 inches, and you might wonder why it's such an oddly specific number. Well, it's because that's roughly the average size of a baby's head. When building officials conduct inspections on new construction, most of them will carry around a 4-inch sphere just to check this. Similarly, when evaluating public play structures, the inspector brings along 2 paddles. One paddle represents the average size of a child's head, and the other matches the largest average size of a child under 10. They use these paddles to check every nook and cranny on the play structure. If the smaller paddle, the head, can pass through, the larger one, the body, should also be able to. Otherwise, the structure won't pass inspection. Story 10. Touching your fresh tattoo with unwashed fingers is a big no-no. It's surprising how many times you have to emphasize this to people. It's just common sense, really. I mean, if you got nicked with a knife, you wouldn't go smearing your grubby fingers all over the wound, right? So why should it be any different when you've been poked hundreds or thousands of times with a needle, covering a wide area? Let me clarify. I get it, there are times when you might need to apply some pressure to a fresh wound to control bleeding, and sure, it might even be necessary to plug it with a finger or two to slow it down until you can reach the hospital. But here's the kicker. It's always a much better idea to do this sort of first aid with sterile bandages or donning sterile gloves on those grubby digits. Long story short, whether you've got hundreds of tiny puncture wounds or just one big one, it's best to avoid rubbing dirty fingers or hands over that newly inked skin if you can help it. Story 11. Heartworms can be treated in dogs but not in cats. Remember to stay diligent with your dog's heartworm prevention. If they do happen to contract heartworm, but you can demonstrate consistent coverage, which isn't complicated, your receipts are sufficient and your vet will have the records, the heartworm prevention manufacturer will cover the treatment expenses. I'd like to add a crucial point. Even your indoor cat or dog can be at risk of heartworms. Mosquitoes can find their way inside too. Oh man, this fact hit me hard. Better save my pets and get a mosquito repellent ASAP. Story 12. Turning your computer or phone off and on again can resolve a solid 70 to 80% of the issues your device might be facing. It's funny how people often see turning it off and on again as a joke, but it genuinely does the trick most of the time. I've been in the IT game for around 20 years, and if no one has messed with the settings, a good old reboot usually does the job. Sometimes things just glitch out and a reset is all they need. Half the time it feels like my job consists of hopping on conference calls with big shot execs, patiently explaining why we should hit that power button and when's the best time to do it. The usual answer is, let's schedule it for 3 weeks from now, on a quiet Sunday morning at 4 a.m. Story 13. Virtually every piece of copper, aluminum, or steel you come across has been recycled and used to make whatever object it's a part of. Dozens, if not hundreds of times. Copper pipe? It probably started out as hundreds of different wires from various devices from around the world. Gold and silver have been recycled even more than that because gold from multiple sources is routinely melted together. It is possible that the gold inside your wedding ring was the object of 1,000 historical crimes. It is also quite possible that some of your gold witnessed the burning of Troy, Carthage, and Tenochtitlan. Gold is the physical essence of human greed and malice. That's what is so great about it. Perhaps now you're thinking, I'd love to read a story about a cursed chunk of gold that's passed down through generations and spreads misfortune. I told this to a geeky friend and he jokingly said, "Can I interest you in an evil piece of jewelry and one vertically challenged man's journey to do a geological field test?" I don't know if he's talking about Lord of the Rings. Story 14. Working as a civil attorney, we rarely find ourselves in a jury trial, and the job can be surprisingly dull, not to mention the time and money it consumes. It's not uncommon for lawsuits, especially those involving hefty sums, to drag on for 3 to 5 years before they find resolution, with expenses easily soaring into the mid-6 figures. I recently wrapped up a case involving an admitted liability car crash. The only question in this one was about the damages. We settled in for a mid-6-figure sum with high 5-figure expenses, primarily for doctors and experts. It took us 3.5 years to get there. Protracted legal battles and a snail-paced justice system? I mean, what else is new? Story 15. It's surprising, but most of the 911 calls that come in for an ambulance on any given day aren't even close to being real emergencies. I'm an EMT and I can vouch for this. Around half of our calls involve transporting patients to or between hospitals. The other half falls into the category of 911 calls. And guess what? Only about half of those 911 calls are genuine emergencies. We only hit the lights and sirens when someone's in deep trouble, facing a real life or death situation. So if you see an ambulance coming your way with lights and sirens blaring, do everyone a favor and make way. Fast. Story 16. I used to work as an insurance adjuster, and let me tell you, most people have no clue what homeowners insurance actually covers. So here's a simple guide to understanding what your homeowner's insurance does. It's all about the sudden and one-time occurrences. Honestly, if you grasp these few words, you're good to understand about 95% of what your policy covers and what it doesn't. Just a quick note, my experience is based on US insurance, so it might vary elsewhere. Now for the important exceptions. Earthquakes and floods, and not the burst pipe kind of floods, those, my friend, require separate coverage. And don't forget about landslides and sinkholes. They're generally left out for the same reasons as earthquakes, ground movement. Story 17. It's a quirky fact that coffee shops often spend more on milk than on coffee. It reminds me of something a wise person once said. Starbucks isn't really in the coffee business. It's all about the milk. And here's a little insider tip. Bigger espresso drinks don't necessarily equal more caffeine. You see, a tall has 1 shot, a grande has 2 shots, and a venti also has 2, unless it's iced, and it gets a bonus 3rd shot. So when customers upgraded to a venti thinking they'd get a caffeine boost, they were actually just getting a bigger milk-to-coffee ratio. If you're after a real caffeine kick, stick to drip coffee. It's your best bet. Now this may seem obvious, but it's worth mentioning. Flavored coffee doesn't come from coffee beans naturally tasting like caramel, vanilla, toffee nut, raspberry, and so on. That delightful flavor comes from a little syrup magic. Did you see that Starbucks recipe leak on TikTok? That ex-employee sure went out with a bang. Story 18. When you delete a file from your hard drive, only the directions to those memory slots are wiped, but the raw data stays put until it's overwritten. That's why companies should go the extra mile and physically destroy their disks when decommissioning them, rather than just a standard format. But here's an exception. If your disk is fully encrypted, you can opt for a format which raises the key necessary to access the drive. Unless you're a bank or handling ultra-sensitive data that must stay locked up, then destruction is the way to go. Story 19. In designing 3D games, many programmers, even at major gaming companies, struggle with colliders, making it so the player doesn't fall through the floor or walk through walls. Everything should work correctly, but of course it doesn't. The solution? Who knows? You'll just layer dozens of colliders on top of each other and hope for the best. That's why there are so many walking through corner glitches. There are probably some programmers and companies who have this figured out, but I'm not qualified to talk about it in detail. I'm just an indie game designer, and I've discussed this with other experienced developers, including some who work for companies like Microsoft. They can confirm that this is a real problem. Glitches like that are just part of the fun for modders, and I'm just here to slay dragons at weird times, clip through walls, and float all over Skyrim. Want to hear more funny stories from other gamers? Then check out Gamers. What are the strangest things you've heard in an open mic? Story 5 is hilarious. See you there.